Hey guys, it's Will from Learnerator, and in this video I'm going to walk you through the 2014 AP Microeconomics free response question. Question number one is always the one that requires more of the time allocation for the free response section of AP Microeconomics. In fact, in this instance, the total point value of this question is 10 points, whereas questions 2 and 3 are only 6 points respectively. That means that you're going to be spending a little bit more time when you're answering question number one. So just something to keep in mind, if you feel like you're spending a little bit more time in answering question number one, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, you're probably doing things right. And as you go through the microeconomics free response section, something to also keep in mind is that you want to make sure that you make total use of your planning period. You're given 10 minutes in the very beginning to kind of think about how you're going to approach the questions. So really think about what the core concepts are that are being tested. And hopefully by walking you through this question, you'll be able to kind of come to understand some of the core concepts that are tested in this respective question on monopolists. So let's go ahead and get started. So this question essentially asks, the graph below shows the demand curve, marginal revenue curve, marginal cost curve, average total cost curve, and long-run average total cost curve for a monopolist. So the important takeaway here is that you are solving a problem for a monopolist. And what that means is that the firm will have market power. And in the case in which a firm has market power, it means that they can set a price higher than marginal costs. And what they'll do is they'll actually set the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal costs. This is the monopolist that would be profit maximizing, because rather than look for the typical, price equals marginal cost, in which a firm is a price taker and they do not have market power, this monopolist actually has market power. So the core concept being tested here is if you understand the difference between a allocatively efficient situation in which price would equal marginal cost and an allocatively inefficient situation in which it might be a monopolist where they would set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost due to their ability to have market power. So remember, keep that in mind. If it's allocatively efficient, then a firm will be a price taker. That means that they would be forced to set price equal to marginal cost, which would be here, because if they were to try to set slightly above that, there are so many other firms out there that the price will still be at marginal cost, and that firm that tried to charge their customers more would make no sales. But in this situation, we are dealing with monopolists, so they will be able to essentially set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, which happens here. So that's the core premise of the question. Let's go ahead and solve part A. So moving on to part A, it's asking you, using the numbers given in the graph, identify each of the following for the profit maximizing monopolist. So as we mentioned before, marginal revenue equals to marginal costs. And so as we work through this question, I'm going to go ahead and kind of highlight the different respective lines that we should be looking at. Here we have the marginal revenue curve. And then here we will have the marginal cost curve, and then we will have an intersection right here. And so this is the quantity that a profit maximizing monopolist would set. So your answer to part one would be Q equals 4. And what I would do as you're writing down these answers is I would actually provide a brief sentence or two explanation of why this is. In this case, I would write something along the lines of marginal revenue equals marginal cost is where the profit maximizing monopolist will set quantities. In this case, marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The intersection occurs at Q equals 4. And that would be my explanation for part one. And the next part of the question is asking you to come up with the price. So now you know the quantity, so all you actually need to do is go up until you reach the point of the demand curve to see what price the monopolist would actually set. Remember, the monopolist has market power, so they have the ability to charge more than marginal costs, so they will charge up to the point in which consumers are willing to pay. So what does this mean? This means that at the price of 40, you will set the price because you know that at the price of 40 there are 4 people that are willing to pay that amount for the good. So that's the answer to part 2. Essentially, my explanation here would be we first found that marginal revenue equals marginal cost at a quantity equals 4, and essentially we know that consumers are willing to pay upwards of 40, or at least 4 of them are, and therefore the monopolist will set the price at 40. And the third question is actually asking you for the allocatively efficient quantity. So this is kind of bringing up that original point that we went over in the last slide when we were thinking about the planning period, and that is where price equals marginal cost. This is where we are allocatively efficient because this is the optimal distribution of goods and services. In other words, the demand will equal the marginal cost because the demand represents the marginal utility of each successive buyer, and therefore you want the optimal distribution of goods and services. In other words, you want where however much happiness or utility I'm getting from selling each additional unit equals the marginal cost of how much it costs the firm to produce that good. So in this case, we're going to set price equal to marginal cost. So price equals marginal cost. That's the same as setting the D equal to MC. And if you look at where D equals MC, it happens right here. So that's the same as where price equals marginal cost, and therefore we know that the allocatively efficient quantity is going to be equal to 8. So that's pretty much it for part A. Essentially, you'd need to identify Q equals 4, P equals 40, and Q equals 8, and then provide a brief sentence or two explanation for each of these respective subparts. So now let's move on to part B. Okay, so let's go ahead and tackle part B. Here we're asked, at the profit maximizing quantity from part A1, is the monopolist experiencing economies of scale? Explain. Well, what we know is that economies of scale means that in the long run, the average total cost for the firm will decrease. And the reason why we know that is because it's more on the intuitive side of economics, in which we know that if we create a firm and that factory just creates just one unit, that one unit is going to be incredibly expensive for that factory. However, if that factory creates a ton of units, then over time, the cost of making that additional unit is going to go down because the factory is going to gain efficiencies, it's going to get better at production, and you can just think about it as each additional unit will decrease the marginal cost of the progressive unit. So that's kind of the idea behind average total cost. The core premise is that in the long run, firms get better and better and more efficient, and therefore they experience economies of scale in which they can increase quantity and see a decrease in their average total cost. And so this question is essentially asking you, does the firm experience in decreasing average total costs as quantity goes up? So let's look at the long run average total costs. In this case, the line is actually horizontal. And what that means is that if I am the firm and I produce just 2 units, it's going to cost me $20. And if it's 4, it's still going to cost me $20 per. And so the main idea here is that with a constant long run average total cost, we are not experiencing economies of scale. And the reason why is because a horizontal long run average total cost denotes a constant average total cost. And so let's make sure that you really understand that. The core premise here is that because the slope of this long run average total cost is horizontal, we are experiencing constant average total costs. That means that regardless of how many units I produce as a firm, I'm still paying $20 per additional unit. So there's no experiencing of this economies of scale effect in which there's a decrease in average total costs. So this is essentially what you would write for your explanation. You would say, no, because the firm is experiencing constant average total costs in which as quantity increases, you are still experiencing the same level in terms of your marginal costs, and therefore there are no economies of scale. So an instance in which you would have had economies of scale might have been if this long-run average total cost curve were going downward sloping. Because as you go and increase your quantity over time, you will notice that the overall cost would be going down. So if you were to just imagine, for example, for the sake of an example, that this marginal revenue equals your long-run average total cost, then you would see that as I go from 2 to 4, my average total cost would be going down. So that's the core concept being tested here. Pretty simple. Just go ahead and write that down and make sure you have an explanation, and you'd get full points for this part. Now let's go ahead and move on to part C. Okay, so now moving on to part C, we're asked, now assume that the monopolist produces 10 units. Using the numbers given in the graph, calculate each of the following. Show your work. So the first part is asking you for the monopolist economic profit. And the first thing that I would do is I would go ahead and find this quantity 10 and see what price consumers are willing to pay, which here would be 10, and how much it costs for the firm to produce, which would be 20. And then what I'd do is I'd go ahead and lay out the equation for profit, which is total revenue equals total cost. And alternatively, another way to write that would be your price minus your marginal cost times your quantity. And the intuition behind that is you are essentially taking the difference between the price that you're setting, how much it costs for you to produce, times however many units that you sell. And so from the actual graph, you can see that that marginal cost is actually interchangeable with average total cost and long-run average total cost. So a third expression could be price minus average total cost times quantity. So in this case, we have everything we need. In fact, we have quantity, which is 10, and we also have the price, which is 10, because that's what consumers are willing to pay. And then we also have what marginal cost is, which to the firm is 20. So here we take these three variables and we plug it into that equation. And so doing that, we have 10 minus 20 times 10, and that will give us negative 10 squared, which is the same as negative 100. And so that is your final answer for part 1 of part C. So what I do when I answer these free response questions is I make sure that I box my answers, just because it makes it a lot easier for the grader to see what specific part you're answering. So now let's move on to part 2. Part 2 asks what the consumer surplus is, and as you know from your class, consumer surplus is essentially the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and what they actually pay. So in this case, here you will see that the consumer surplus is the equivalent of this triangle. It is here they're willing to pay 10, and then it goes all the way up here to the 60, and then comes all the way back, and it would be this triangle right here. And so we know that here we have 1/2 base times height, because that's the formula for a triangle. And then we know that there would be Q equals 10, and that's also going to be the same as my base. And I also know that my height is going to be the difference between the price and what I'm willing to pay. So here, the difference is going to be 60 minus 10, which is equal to 50. And therefore, I know that my consumer surplus would equal 1/2 times the base, which is 10, times the height, which is 50, and therefore it would be 500 over 2, or 250. And that's my consumer surplus. And then part C, or part 3, is asking what is the deadweight loss incurred from this situation. And as you know, the deadweight loss is the loss of efficiency from an equilibrium when it's not allocatively efficient. So remember, allocatively efficient would have been back at Q equals 8, where price equals marginal cost. Here we're at 10, and therefore your deadweight loss is actually going to be this triangle right here. So I'm going to see if I can actually go ahead and draw that out. Okay. In fact, I think I'm going to change this color to blue so that you can see that a little bit more clearly. Okay, so that's your deadweight loss. So we need to calculate that, and that's again another right triangle, and therefore we can use the equation a half base times height. Here we know that the overall height is going to be 20 minus 10, so height is going to equal 10. And we know that the base is going to be the difference between the quantities, so 10 minus 8. So your base is going to equal 2. And then plugging that in, we know that deadweight loss is equal to 1/2 times 2 times 10. And then these cancel, so we're just left with a deadweight loss of 10. Box that. And that's it for part C. So let's go over, before we move on to part D, everything behind this question. The first part is asking you for the economic profit, so you identified what the profit equation is, and then you went ahead and identified what the respective quantity, price, and marginal cost is. And the second part, you solved what consumer surplus is, which, as I go back and go ahead and shade that in for you so that you can clearly see the extent of the consumer surplus. You know that that is the consumer surplus. And then finally, the deadweight loss is the loss of efficiency from an equilibrium when it's not allocatively efficient, which was this triangle right here, and therefore we calculated for that area. And that's pretty much it for part C. So part D is asking at what quantity is demand unit elastic? Well, this is testing you on the concept of demand elasticity, and essentially what you know here is that unit elastic means that marginal revenue would equal 0. And the core premise behind that is really the idea behind elasticity. So unit elastic, if you really remember that definition, is it's when a supply or a demand curve is perfectly responsive to a change in price. So it's a one-to-one change. And so the difference here would be if they were asking you if where the quantity is demand elastic, then you'd be looking for where marginal revenue is positive. So marginal revenue is positive when it's elastic, and that would mean that it's really easy to switch over in terms of your quantities. And then alternatively, marginal revenue would be negative where it's inelastic, and the idea there would be that it's very difficult to switch over. So here we have inelastic. So as you work through these questions, if they ever ask you for where it's demand unit elastic, you are looking for where marginal revenue is going to equal 0. Because that would be the situation in which you have a demand curve that's perfectly responsive to a change in price. So let's look at where marginal revenue equals 0. So marginal revenue will intersect the horizontal axis at Q equals 6, and therefore that's our answer. So Q equals 6, and we would go ahead and explain that it's Q equals 6 because that's where marginal revenue equals 0. And that's pretty much it for part D. So that part is just 1 point, so it's a pretty quick part of the overall question. So let's move on to the final part, part E. Okay, so in part E we're asked, suppose the monopolist perfectly price discriminates and chooses the quantity that maximizes profit. Determine the dollar value of each of the following: the monopolist profit and the consumer surplus. So what do we know about perfect price discrimination? Well, we know that another name for it is first-degree price discrimination, and that the idea is that the monopolist will charge the different prices for every single unit that it possibly can. So in other words, the monopolist will maximize every possible price to capture all of the consumer surplus. So first let's think about what the consumer surplus would have been in a perfectly competitive market. So let's see where price equals marginal cost first. And if you remember from the prior parts of the video, we know that price equals marginal cost at a quantity of 8. And essentially what that means is that the consumer surplus would be this triangle right here. And so the idea behind perfect price discrimination is that the monopolist is going to take all of this because it can properly identify every single respective buyer and then essentially charge them exactly what they're willing to pay. So let's go ahead and solve now for the monopolist profit in a perfect price discrimination situation. The equation for a triangle that is right, a right angle by nature is going to be a half base times height, and therefore your base is going to equal this, which is going to be 8 minus 0, or just 8, and then your height is going to equal this distance, which is 60 minus 20, which is the same as 40, and therefore your consumer surplus that you would have originally gotten from perfect price discrimination, but which is now the monopolist profit, is going to be a half base times height, so a half 8 times 40, and therefore we know that 8 divided by 2 is 4 times 40. Your monopolist profit from perfect price discrimination is then 160, and that's the dollar value. So now that we've actually solved part 1, part 2 is really simple because part 2 is asking you what the consumer surplus would be. And as we just talked about, in a perfect price discrimination situation, the monopolist is taking all of the original consumer surplus for themselves because they can properly identify each respective buyer. And therefore the consumer surplus will equal 0 because there is no more consumer surplus since the monopolist has taken it all for profit for himself. So again, let's make sure we really cement this concept in. The idea behind perfect price discrimination is that the monopolist can properly identify every single buyer at their willingness to pay. And what that means is that whereas in a perfect price competition scenario, there is a difference in almost what we call a consumer surplus in terms of what the consumer actually pays and what the value is that they get from that good. In this case, in perfect price discrimination, the monopolist is going to seize that difference and take it for themselves. And therefore, the monopolist profit is 160 and the consumer surplus is 0. And that would be pretty much it for this first question of the 2014 AP Microeconomics exam. By answering the way that we've answered through these parts, we would have gotten a perfect score of a 10 out of 10 for every single part of this question. So before we go, if you need more practice, feel free to check out www.learnerator.com. We have hundreds of AP Microeconomics practice questions of varying difficulties, easy, medium, and difficult, and so you'll be able to get all the practice that you need. And if you have any questions for me, feel free to shoot me an email at hello@learnerator.com. That's it for now. See you next time.